Hi, I'm Andrew Wasson. Thanks for tuning in to my weekly guitar blog. It is Saturday, April 2nd, 2011. And if you're not familiar with the guitar blog here, what we do every week is we catch up on a lot of the emails that are getting sent into my guitar blog website at andrewwasson.com. So I'm going to start off with an email that came to me from Juda out in Tel Aviv, Israel. He wrote in saying, my question is about improvising. The thing is, when I sit down and learn licks from musicians, for example, like Marty Freidman, etc., I practice them just like I should. I learn it in different octaves, change keys, add my own variations. I even dissect the theory, like what time signature it's in, what mode is used, or constructing a chord that's being arpeggiated. But what happens is when in a band situation, my improvising skills plummet down into the abyss. Instead, I play boring pentatonic passages and bland modal solos. Where did all my phrasing go? This doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, it really gets me down. By the way, this problem also occurs with my rhythms too. I hope you can help me out here. Well, Judah, thanks for writing in. You know, your question, I picked it because it's a very common situation that happens with a lot of people. Now, to explain this a little bit better, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. I'm going to talk about this in relationship to what it would perhaps be like with another situation entirely. And the situation that I'm going to pick is that of, imagine if you were going to do sales of any kind. Likely what you'd probably do is take a sales course. You know, maybe if you got hired by a company, some big corporation, they would send you through their sales program and you would learn techniques and you'd learn methodologies, you'd learn phrases that you should say and all kinds of stuff that will hopefully close the sale. And I guess if you're working for some corporation, that means commissions in your pocket. So obviously, you want to make the sales, you know, probably you have quotas that you got to meet anyway. So there's all this stuff that gets put upon you. So there's not only these techniques, these concepts, methodologies that you got to learn to make the sale, but then there's the added pressure when you get out into the field and use these techniques to be able to actually make the commissions and probably earn a living. Now, I chose this type of scenario because it's a lot like the scenario of playing music. So let's shift back to the world of music now and try to get the perspective together of what I'm trying to say. Now, when you go and analyze solos and you learn licks and learn runs and lines to develop your playing, you're learning mechanical things. You're learning about, you know, what the line is. Is it a 16th note triplet run? Is it a 16th note idea, a 32nd note idea? What mode does it come from? You know, is it a Phrygian thing? Is it a natural minor scale idea? Is it a pentatonic concept? You're learning technical things too, you know, things about the fingerboard and how your hands feel to rip through the notes and so on and so forth. And that kind of mechanical stuff takes time before it actually really gets straightened away live in front of an audience or even possibly at a band rehearsal. Now, let me just shift things back to that whole sales concept and example that I was speaking of a moment ago. And let me bring that back into perspective too. So you got a job, let's say, with some corporation. You're doing all these sales techniques and learnings and strategies. And then you finish that and you go into the field and you start trying to sell to real live breathing human beings. You know, so it's a lot different and probably would take most people quite a long time before they can really close those sales and use those techniques and gain the right group of techniques and methodologies that work for them as a person to be able to make those sales. Now, let's go back to the world of music again and take what you learn when you study technique and you learn about ideas on theoretical elements and all this musical stuff, and you got it down onto your fingerboard, let's say when you're at a band rehearsal, or maybe if you're just sitting, you know, jamming at home in your practice room or practice area. Then all of a sudden, when you get on stage, there's a whole bunch of other elements, you know, factoring into things. And you, especially the fact that you've got a lot more adrenaline flowing through you, and there's a demand placed upon you because you're live. You know, you have an audience of whatever size in front of you to be, and you're under the gun, let's just say, to be able to perform. So, you know, it kind of makes me think about I had read a long time ago an article, and if you're a fan at all of the 80s shredder guys, you may recognize the term or the old record label, Shrapnel Records. Back in the 80s, that was a huge label run by Mike Varney. I think a lot of those guys wound up going to, there was another subsidiary, I think, off of that by Polygram. But anyway, I remember reading about one of the players off that label. And there was some pretty crazy guitar players on that label. I know Vinnie Moore was on there. I know Tony McAlpine was on that label. You'd mentioned Marty Freidman in your email. Jason Becker, if you'll remember the Cacophony stuff. You know, this is the caliber of players that were on there. There were some really monster shredders. I remember also one of the guys I thought was fantastic there was Michael E. Firkins. I don't know if you recall him, but I mean, all these guys were amazing. But I remember reading an article about one of those dudes, and the whole article was kind of about what they did before they got discovered by Mike Varney and they did their first release on the Shrapnel Records label. And what struck me as kind of interesting is how hard this particular, I wish I could remember who it was, but all that aside, how hard this guy worked at developing songs with his top 40 band that he was working in when he was back in you know, whatever city it was before he moved to LA and jumped on board the Shrapnel Records train. But what they were doing, as the goal of this guy's top 40 band was to rehearse like crazy through the week. And then when they had their top 40 gigs, you know, over the weekend, which, you know, primarily is going to be Thursday, Friday, Saturday night at the clubs, their goal was, or his goal in particular, was to play the guitar solos from the tunes they were doing. And they were doing some pretty heavy-hitting tunes. They had the Randy Rhoads era, Ozzy Osbourne stuff. They were doing stuff, if I recall correctly, from Eddie Van Halen. You know, all this is pretty heavy stuff to play live, especially with a goal of playing the solos note for note perfect. So if you look at something like that as an example of someone who worked their chops up to, you know, just a phenomenal level to be able to achieve note for note perfection with solos. And I also recall, I think it was one of the things that grabbed my attention about that article, is that the local newspapers were doing some stories about the band because the guitar solos were perfectly note for note off the albums. So you can imagine if they had a goal like that, they rehearsed their butts off and actually achieved it, and we're starting to get notoriety from the local newspapers, entertainment columns, and so on. This is a pretty amazing level to reach, and to go from the mechanical end of it of practicing up to the stage and keep the chops 100% up there, that's going to take a lot of time and a lot of practice, just like I had started my discussion off talking about the sales thing of taking the sales course and then taking it into the public realm and trying to actually sell those products or whatever it may be. It takes time. You got to be able to develop your skill so when you're up in front of an audience, you can actually blow through that stuff just as easily as you can as if you're sitting at home rehearsing it. So there you go. I know that is a really big level of work to get involved with, and it's obviously going to also take a lot of time up on stage jamming out. But that is my answer for you. I think that's the solution if you want to attain that level of skill. So let's take a look at the next question that's coming up. It's from Robert D, and he wrote in saying, I'm somewhat of a beginner, and I'm finding it hard to figure out how chords and notes that are higher up on the fretboard relate to open chords or other notes. Is there some shortcut or pattern that I should be using? When you have chords up higher on the fingerboard, basically those would be different voicings than as you move to other, you know, layouts of the chord down, let's say, you know, lower if you had your basic open G, for instance. That G is going to have a different arrangement of notes as you travel along the fingerboard and go to other locations of the G chord. Now, the perfect way to learn this whole strategy is by making a study of octave patterns. Down low here, we've got an octave pattern of G notes, for instance, going from the 6th string 3rd fret G to an open 3rd string G and another G up here at the 1st string 3rd fret. Now what happens with these octave patterns is as they move laterally along the neck, the open 3rd string G just becomes the 4th string 5th fret. It's the same note, it's called a unison. And that 4th string 5th fret G is also located at the 10th fret of the 5th string. You can hear that they're identical. Do You just get a little bit different balance of tone because the diameter of the string is changing and then the length of the string is changing. But otherwise, it's really the exact same pitch or tone. So as you move along the guitar and you start understanding how the various forms of these different chords, this is all a G chord, by the way, will move across the neck, you get an idea about several different kinds of patterns. Now, the patterns stay the same when you relate them to other chords. Like, for instance, I had played a G at the 7th position right here. Now, if I slide that shape over down a whole step, I get an F. If I slide it a semitone, I get an E. Another whole step gives me a D. If I go another whole step, I get a standard open position C chord. So there's a number of ways to approach this. There's also a method of study. You can check on my Creative Guitar Studio YouTube channel because I have a video on there that's talking about a method called the cage theory. So you may want to look at that. Also study as much as you can about octave patterns and how they relate across the fingerboard. Also think very laterally, like take a simple shape like perhaps, well, I just done the C major shape. That's a really straightforward one. Or you could use something like maybe A minor. Often I'll use that chord and show students how chords move laterally. So if you take a basic A minor, refinger it so you're going ring finger, baby finger there, pinky, in other words, and a middle finger, and then free up the use of your index. That A minor, if you slide it up a whole step, now you have B minor. Another semitone is C minor. So you can start understanding how chords move along, and as long as you know the names of your notes off of the 6th, 5th, and 4th strings, you should be able to track and trace out all of those open position chords. And by the way, the cage theory is just discussing C chord, A chord, G, E major, and D major. And of course, there's the minor counterparts, so you could do both major and minor. Pull them out along the neck and study the cage theory, study your octave patterns, and that should help clear up all that information. Okay, so this is coming to us from Marcos. And he wrote in saying, my question is, how do guitarists know where on their instruments to play music written in standard music notation? Up until now, I've been learning how to play the notes with music notation, and I've been using guitar tabs in order to know where I should play what's notated. Well, this gets into the whole realm of music reading. I have several music reading videos. I'll put a link in the description box underneath this post. So you can check out some of the music reading videos that I put together. But basically, how things work on the neck is it's very open. You get to select when you're reading a piece of music notation where you want to play something. So let's say in a piece of notation we wind up getting, I don't know, let's say a D note, which would be found on the 2nd string of the, the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. On the music staff, that particular D would be found on the 4th line of the music staff. But you could also play that D over here. That's the 3rd string, 7th fret D of the same note. You'll also have it available to you at the 12th fret of the 4th string. So as you go along your neck, you can see there's at least 3 places that are really easy and accessible. There's also this high one, but I mean, you're getting pretty high up the neck there, so it's not extremely accessible. Plus, it's kind of clustered lower down onto the 5th string. So for a music reading piece, that might not be the most advantageous area to play that note of D. But what you generally do with your piece of music, if you're reading something, is you go through the piece and you find your highest tone in the piece and you find your lowest tone, and that will give you an overall general range. And what you do is you go to your guitar and you find those particular notes and you range them out, and you'll find the location on the fingerboard of where to play that particular piece. Now, if the piece is long, like if you're doing one of those, canons or partitas or something by Bach or Beethoven, those tend to be pretty long, so you may need to constantly be rejigging where you're going along the fingerboard. So one area might be good for one segment of the tune, but as the tune evolves and goes, you may have to go along the neck to different areas. So essentially, that's how it's done. You're going to need to really dig your heels into studying music notation. I'll probably be good for you if I put a link underneath to some good music reading books that you can start digging your heels into, because that should help you as well. Okay, let's go to the next question. Okay, so this final question is coming to us from Brad, and he wrote in saying, this is a very common question I'll mention up front. A lot of people have trouble with this. He wrote in saying, I'm working on chord melody, and I'm really struggling with it. I have a fake book with jazz tunes in it. I've been working on making arrangements using the chord inversions that I know, but it's still a struggle for me. I pretty much just play different inversions of chords as I follow the melody in the book, and this leads to very, I like this choice of words here, vanilla playing. Can you help me get a sense of when to switch from chords to scales, when to play walking bass lines, and when and where to add inversions and tension? Well, that's a pretty tall order for any one guitar instructional video, but it's even a taller order for just a quick guitar blog, response like this one. But what I need to tell you, and I do a lot of work with students on chord melody. It's a very popular topic for students that I have that like a lot of solo guitar, sometimes even acoustic stuff, and they're branching out into jazz. Now, first thing I tell students that I work with in this department is to do chord melody effectively, you've got to know a ton of a bucket load of chords. You have to know so many shapes, so many concepts about how chords operate, how to deal with tension, that it takes a while. So you definitely want to have part of your practice studying ideas that are based around things like maybe, getting your sharp fives together, get your flat fives together, understand some flat nines, go into some of your sharp nine, flat nine changes on different strings, whatever. Go crazy on extensions like your 9th chords, your 13th chords, learn some different locations for them. Get a handle on what 11ths are all about, suspended chords, learn a whole whack of inversions, but it sounds like you're getting involved with that now. And this is the start there, because what you'll be doing, oh, and I forgot to mention diminished and diminished 7th, but sorry to regress like that. But this is what you got to do. You have to learn tons of chords, and then as you're doing your melody line, like let's say you've got a melody line, I'll just get a couple of notes together for you. Like let's say you're going from this G here on the 2nd string to an F sharp to an E. There's lots of ways you can cover those changes. You could start off, with having the G around a, this is an augmented chord, a B dominant 7 sharp 5. Maybe you could try going into just a plain dominant 7th after that. Maybe you could try switching, to another chord. Maybe you could try going diminished, ahead. But see, you got all these choices. If you know tons of chords, you've got all these selections now to go around notes and find what you want. You could, you can almost play a game with it sometimes. I'll teach students this method of trying to maintain one bass note and then move other notes, under that. And then try doing movements in the bass that may move upwards chromatically, maybe move downwards in scale tones. So there's all these options. But the other side of it too is you got to work a lot with understanding your diminished chords, because those diminished chords are very cool when it comes to chord melody. So you can start getting a handle on, where you want to place a triad diminished, or maybe you want to go to a minor 7 flat 5, or maybe you want to use a fully diminished chord like the diminished 7th. So you start adding in the diminished elements. You use a lot of dominants, because remember, those dominants are very effective. You can use them as flat 5 substitutes. They can function as secondary dominant chords. And you can start messing with how all these applications take place. You can even take things like your altered chords and invert those chords. So this is the bottom line. You gotta learn a ton of chords and start experimenting with how those bass notes move around, how the diminished can get popped in, and then how you want to have, I'd mentioned bass notes moving around, but maybe also experiment a lot with static bass notes. And then there's this whole other element to it of getting involved with walking bass lines. So adding, you had mentioned that in your email about when to add in walking bass lines. Well, wherever you might find it appropriate. I would probably say, I know that's not probably the answer you're looking for, but you got to be creative and you got to be experimental. What I would probably suggest, though, is take a look at learning some chord melody pieces by maybe Pat Martino, maybe take a look at some of the Joe Pass stuff, and also do not write off all of those great folk fingerstyle players, because a lot of those guys are pretty darn well versed in what's going on with chord melody. So definitely check those guys out too. Check out guys like Don Ross. There's a fantastic guy, you probably heard of him. He's famous now on YouTube. His name's Andy McKee. Maybe check out some of his stuff. The only trouble with some of these guys is sometimes they go into some pretty wacky tunings. So maybe that might not be super, aligned with what's going on with just standard tuning and jazz chord melody. But you will probably glean ideas off of these people. So hopefully that bounces you over to a new direction of learning with your chord melody stuff. I think if you take a concept of maybe buying a few books, learning a few people's pieces, and then really going bananas on learning that whole, gamut of chords that I had mentioned, I think you're going to start to see some strides in your playing within probably even the next month and a half or so. But anyway, that's about all the time that I have for today. So thanks for watching as usual, and thanks again for sending in all the great questions. And keep in mind that I now have a weekly podcast that comes out every Monday. You'll find that in the podcast section of my blog site over at andrewwasson.com. Until next time, take care, and we'll catch up again on my next video blog. Thanks a lot, and bye for now.